Okay, cool. Hi everyone, welcome to this week's catalog sync. And let us go to the community sync notes first. So for highlights, we don't have anything this week, so we can just jump into the discussion topics. Does anyone have any additional highlights that want to be mentioned?
Do we want to touch on some of the ones that we've discussed before and to see where they are and what needs to be done at this point? Because we're moving along in topics, but then I don't know what happened with the previous topics and are we actually making progress in those areas?
Right, that's a good point. I think the discussion topics actually covers quite a few important ones. The first one is the server-side capabilities, and the second one is the TCK that was concluded as the next step for a lot of the topics, like do we need server-side implementations, how do we verify the spec, etc. Are there any other topic we want a follow-up?
Well, just looking at the list from before, we have the namespace behaviors. We had, I'm trying to see which ones we'd already covered. The add or the plan, pre-plan, and where that is. And I don't know, I feel like we're missing some topics from before.
Okay. I guess I can take an action item that I can summarize all the topics we have discussed and see how much we have closed and how much are still hanging on. Specifically for the two you brought up, I think there are some additional discussions on the dev list about namespace operation behaviors. And sounds like the conclusion, which is also what we were talking in the last sync, was that it's kind of concluded vaguely that we don't want to enforce very strict behaviors, but also we don't, but also if there's any possibility for generalizing some specific actions, we can do that. But there wasn't any concrete actions like what we are going to do next.
Okay, and then where are we with the plan, pre-plan one?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think I didn't brought that up explicitly because most of the things are just going on in the PR. There were a few reviews of the ongoing PR for adding the spec. I guess actually right here is the owner of that. So you raise a hand. Are you trying to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think Jack made a couple of, big changes which were good in terms of adding a scan context so that, between the different types of scans, whether it's like incremental or just a regular snapshot scan, that model can just be reused. I haven't seen any comments from you, Daniel or Ryan. So I think Amog also took a look and left some comments. And then I made like a very minor spec change. But it seems, I think that at least from like that initial review before, a couple like, months back, that we had aligned for the most part. And then I think, Jack was just trying to refine it further. But, if you guys or anyone else from the community has time to take a look at it, be really appreciated to see how we can get this moving.
Okay, so it looks like it's waiting on some reviews just to finalize the spec changes, and then we'll move into implementation.
Yep.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add for that is like for anybody who might be working on some of the other language implementations, you may also want to take a look at those. FACO for Python and Rust, because I would assume that we want implementations across all the.
Yeah, of course, I can take a look.
Okay, any other topics before we move to the discussions? Okay, so the first topic is again the server-side capabilities. Thank you, Edward, for putting up the design doc. I think quite a few of us here and also not here have read the doc. My impression of just summarizing the main discussion point seems like we want to check why do we want to have these server-side capabilities versus what we were originally doing for example, the metrics API, which is to introduce a metrics API enabled flag. Sorry, I forgot the exact name. So I guess this goes back to the original context. I think Daniel, Amog, or Edward, when introducing the Vue API, why was the decision made to, instead of introducing, for example, a new flag like load view enabled flag, versus introducing this kind of server-side capabilities? I guess we just need more background about why we want to do this.
Why we want to capabilities versus, what are you describing as the properties? Are you saying
Correct, yes.
for the for the metrics one, is that coming through the original config route? Is that what you're saying?
Correct, yes.
So conceptually, I would think that they're roughly the same thing. It's just we're standardizing that interface, right? So you could just like shove all this in properties, right? But then everything needs to know about all the properties and what those behaviors are. Edward, do you want to?
Yeah. The one thing I wanted to add to that is like, yeah, you could do that through properties, but the one downside that you cannot do with properties is like, how do you know when those things evolve? Like, you don't know. Like, do you just add new properties as you go? Like, let's assume you add a new, whatever. Like, you add new APIs to views, and those evolve from what is currently there. Do you add new flags? Do you add new properties? Or like the reason why we were thinking about capabilities is the long term how this would look when we add new stuff to RESTspec.
There's another piece which is
a proper way of like representing this and communicating this to the client. That was the main goal.
The other thing was with the tags, as we were looking at what the options were with the like defining this as part of the open API spec, is being able to actually tag the endpoints that are associated with those capabilities, so that you have some reference for, hey, what does this actually cover, or what does it entail in terms of the relationship between that property and the various endpoints within the REST spec. So that's why the endpoints are also tagged with something that corresponds to those server capabilities.
I see.
You have a property, like what does that mean? Like what does that tell you about the actual REST specification? Nothing. You would all have to do that externally through some other documentation to say, hey, for this property, then I have to point at these other endpoints. So with this, you can actually just tie those things directly one-to-one.
Okay, and then that goes back to what exactly is the criteria for adding a new capability? I think that was also not clear to me, because just going back to what Edward you were saying, like for example, what if a Vue API evolves, but in what way? Like I think because when looking into the design, it feels to me that we are proposing essentially this capability for two things: the load view and also the multi-table commit, right? And those have relatively big impact on the client side, such that you want a distinct you want the client to differentiate different behaviors. But to what extent do we cut the line? Because in many places in the past conversations, there are discussions about, hey, if we add this capability, then the client can do some actions, minor or major, to control the behavior. But I think I'm coming from the angle that we don't want to put too many responsibility to the client, because that increases the complexity of implementing that interaction. And yeah.
there's two different situations there. Like the two that you gave as examples are quite different. Like the view actually has real meaning in terms of client behavior, in that if you are a client and you need to like list view, load view, this gets back to that original problem that we discussed, where if you get a response from like a load view, you don't know that it's like, oh, permission is denied, or like the server doesn't implement it. Like, there's not enough clarity just from the REST response to know which one of those it is. So the client actually needs to differentiate whether the server supports views or not. The other one, multi-table commit, and some of the other ones that we've talked about here are kind of additional extension features that the client can leverage, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the client needs to like take different action based on what it gets from the server. It's just like, can I do this operation or not?
No, I think in the dev list, sorry, Dimitri, let me finish this sentence. I'll give it to you. In the original dev list discussion, my memory is that for views, the specific point was that this config is really controlling the load view behavior, because let's say you don't support list views, right? Then the server will fail naturally. Whatever error it throws, it will fail naturally, and the client doesn't need to do anything specific about that. So the tag is really for the load view to distinguish the feature.
I mean, it's
No, it's
Right.
it's the same for list view.
or it's not just load view. It's like whatever actions related to views you would do, it you can express on the client side that, hey, the server that I'm currently talking to does not support that feature.
And what will so you are saying if there is a list view, sorry, if I don't support list view feature, and the client receives that capability, then it is going to directly fail at the client side, for example, instead of even talking to the server.
Yep. For example.
But in that case, why is that? Like there, I feel there it starts to get into like how fine-grained do we want to control the client behavior, right?
Well, no, I'm not sure that I follow the scenario that you're talking about, because like a list view operation, again, it's a question of, does the server support it, or is the client being denied because they don't actually have access as that client to perform that operation? And they can receive a 403 either way. Like the recommended way of dealing with unsupported endpoints is not to say like, oh, I don't support this, or 404. Like if you want to be really secure, you would send back a 403 and just say, hey, you're not authorized to do that operation, even though we don't support it. So a client doesn't know whether list views is being rejected because the server doesn't support it, or because that client doesn't have access. And those are two
but
different things.
what's the issue of not dealing with that behavior, right? The end user always see a kind of list view because of 403, which seems to be the correct behavior, right?
Well, but you don't know if it doesn't exist. Do you know if
but-
it doesn't exist, or does it, like, so if you did have access, you would get a 404 if it doesn't exist, but you don't know because you got a 403 whether you don't have access, it doesn't exist. So there's a number of these that are going to happen with views specifically, where the client actually doesn't have enough information to respond properly without knowing whether the server actually supports it or not.
And think about, like, right now, yes, we only have views and multi-table commits that we are introducing, capabilities for. But long term, there will be things like user-defined functions. They will probably add new APIs. There's the whole, scan planning and stuff. So that's why we're thinking long term in terms of like, how do we express telling from the server to the client this is supported or not, and like how to do backwards compatible scenarios look like.
I see. I guess let me think about that for a while. I guess, Dimitri, what's your comment?
So you actually have a couple of comments, but kind of I'll start with the one that is closer to what we're discussing. Like from my point of view, I still don't see, like I think we're discussing two different aspects. So one is actually a specification, a way to specify behaviors that the server supports. and another one is how to make clients' lives easier. I think we're confounding them because I still don't really see how it helps a client dealing with errors it receives from the server if it knows the server supports the feature views, for example, right?
Well, that helps distinguish the question of like am I getting access denied because it doesn't exist or because I don't have access? If I get a 403,
yeah. So
and
what do I do?
well, so if the server does support views and I
Okay.
get a 403 in a list view operation, then it's because of access denied.
Yeah,
That's what you should assume.
What if the 403 was sent by a layer 7 proxy somewhere in front of this? Yeah, that's my point.
I mean,
the client does not know that. And that's the point I was trying to make in comments. Because if the communication is not positive, we cannot be sure who actually responded.
I think that's probably outside of what we're trying to handle here, because there's all sorts of situations where you could have that particular problem and it's going to cause issues with the client not knowing for certain. Like, I mean, that could happen with the load table and it says, oh, authorization denied. And it's like, well, I had access to that table. So who do you blame in that protocol at that point? Well, it's whatever is causing that problem within the connectivity. So I think we're taking this a little too far in those cases. It's not meant to resolve every potential like network glitch or access control issue. It is under normal procedure. If I get a 403 back, I should be able to either assume that I'm not allowed to hit that endpoint because of authorization, or I need to know that like I'm getting that back because it's actually not supported. Like those are the two main situations that we're concerned about here.
Yeah, if we just want to rule out the fact that the server does not support a particular feature, then we're going back to the properties question. I mean, just solving that particular level of difficulty does not require a full version specification, right? We can just say the server injects a property saying it supports views, and then we're good, right? We can just continue. That's only that's what, just to clarify the relationship of an endpoint that declares configuration with like a vectorized version versus just having simple properties. Yeah, go ahead, Edward.
Yeah, so like as I mentioned earlier, like yes, we could go down the route of like just having properties, but again, how do you represent evolving APIs with properties? You can't.
Yeah, no, I see that. I see your point. I'm just trying to kind of distinguish the cases,
like
the error handling case from the specification
properties. That would work, but like what does happen? What do we want to do in the long term? Do we want to just introduce new properties whenever a new API gets added?
At the same time, if we go with the capabilities endpoint, we're essentially making
it's not an endpoint. It's just a property in the config.
Is it?
Once it's not a new endpoint. It's just
I must have missed it.
Yeah. So this is again gets back to the question of like we tend to lean into using properties for a lot of things because it's like you can shove a whole lot into a map, but we want this to actually be somewhat well defined. It has benefit in terms of like understanding and reading the REST spec and like, hey, what do I actually need to implement if I want to provide these capabilities, as opposed to just properties. And in this case, like enumerating that within the REST specification, I think has a lot of value, as opposed to saying, hey, you had the REST spec, but you've actually got this secondary spec too of properties that also applies to how you interact with the REST spec.
Yeah. Sorry, it was my confusion. I assumed it was coming from a separate endpoint. So yeah, then we're okay. Then at this point, I would just like to clarify that if we're introducing capabilities, we're essentially making the REST spec version become a vectorized version, right? So it's not a single number; it's a vector of numbers.
We just try versions for the capabilities, and the capabilities, it's just a new optional property that is coming back in the config response. That's it.
And the reason that we had discussed like making the versioning non-linear is because you don't need to implement all of these, and they may all evolve somewhat independently of each other. So, the pre-planned plan may kind of go and have a couple iterations on it, but if servers are not supporting it, they don't need to increment the entire REST-spec version every time that, like, hey, a view specification changes, or one of the other endpoints that they do support changes. It does get more complicated, but at the same time, I think that like moving all of those capabilities together in lockstep, and then making sure anybody who builds a REST server has to say, I adhere to a particular version, but then also not include some features or be behind in other areas, gets really complicated for the implementers.
No, I don't actually oppose the idea of vectorized version definition for the REST specification. Yeah. That works fine for me.
Okay, just from a time perspective, I think we want to move forward to other topics. I guess we can rehash all the discussion points here in the design doc and see if there are any other missing points. Does that sound good to everyone?
You also wanted to go do another look on it, Jack?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Cool. So the next topic is standardized REST catalog properties. I don't know if
that was actually that's a little confusing, because the title of the document and the discussion in the dev list was actually about file IO properties, not about REST catalog properties.
correct. I think there the REST catalog property was put up as another item similar to the file IO properties, but I don't have lots of context about this one. But looking through the thread, seems like the REST catalog was mentioned also multiple times about we want to standardize the properties there across different language implementations. I don't know if there is any disagreements about that, but
I think generally both for like file IO and REST catalog properties, people like want consistency. I think one of the things that we started avoiding a little while ago as much as possible was any values that would be language specific. So like the file IO impl was a good example of one where originally we were passing back an actual class name. And so we want to make them somewhat implementation agnostic in terms of what the properties are. But we also have a ton out there right now. And it's been raised before, especially by the Trino community, that some of the properties in both file IO and configuration and behavior like Spark specific, but they don't really call that out. So I think that there's kind of a broader question around what do we want to do with properties across the board, like table properties, write properties, read properties. I don't know, Russell, like you nodded your head. I assume you've run into this.
Yeah, I was thinking explicitly about like distribution mode, which when we added it, I think like the intent was that, everyone could be able to kind of take advantage of this. And then in practice, it turns out that it's like difficult for engines like Flink and Trino to actually do the same things we were doing in Spark. So it probably makes sense to move those things into more engine specific properties. But I do think there's definitely a huge class of things in file IO that we should standardize. I don't know if this is a huge priority for right now. I'm not sure what we would have for REST catalog right now, because I don't know, that feels like the implementations are going to be different enough that you would probably have to do a whole new configuration anyway. If they're so similar that you can kind of just drag and drop between two, then I don't think they would exist as two separate projects. I don't know.
Yeah. Jack, which were the properties that were called out for the REST catalog in that thread?
My understanding are basically the ones related to configuring OAuth tokens and like SegWit stuffs. I'm not aware of anything else.
Yeah, for anything with like security and on auth, feels like that belongs to like the auth specific portion of the spec. Yeah, I mean, that you can just say these are our recommended things, but I don't know.
Yeah, so from the other language, we try to copy them as much as possible. But I think also one important thing is that they're not always well documented. So I think that's step one. And then we can just make sure that we consolidate everything from there on.
Yeah, so then do we want to say, like right now we have a lot of the properties documented in the docs for table properties, write behaviors, read behaviors, things like that. I would look to those and that direction for like file IO properties largely. I don't know what we do about file IOs that are specific to an implementation, because you have that kind of cross dimension as well, because like AWS, GCP, Azure, you know, Dell ECS or whatever it is, like they all have different properties and configuration that only apply to those implementations. And I think we have some of them documented, but like the AWS file IO properties, it's got a huge set of properties. I don't think most of them are documented other than the Java. So for the REST specific ones, do we want to just say, we'll put that in the REST spec and reference those from either the description section, or I don't know if there's anything in the Open API spec that would allow for this as a more like standardized representation.
Yeah, looking at the dev list, it seems like this is also specifically brought up from the config part of the load table result. That is actually referencing all the file IO properties. So I guess that is why standardizing that is called out in the REST catalog.
I mean, most of those we've taken directly from like AWS and Google documentation, though, right? Like, if you use something else, that'd be a little weird. I don't know.
So it seems like the goal of at least that thread is partly to standardize the file property, and then, for example, the REST spec can directly reference that to say, hey, for example, the load table response config will contain properties following that standard specification.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we just kind of come in a circle, because now it's like, okay, REST spec is pointing to docs on properties, which we have docs on properties, and it's not complete. And I think that just means that we need to do a better job of documenting properties for file IO implementations. But we already have, like, if you think about what we're doing in that config route, though, is you're providing configuration or overrides for those properties that are already spelled out. And so all of the read and write properties that are defined, things that are being used by the reference implementations, those are the set that can be sent back from that config route. So, you know, it almost sounds like, well, we just need to document those properties better in the docs.
In general, do we consider properties a part of the spec?
No.
No.
I would say we have 3, I think, properties in the Iceberg table spec that are like outright called out, and each of those I think has been like a mistake when we did it.
But we also don't require that you adhere to those properties. So implementations, you know, like this is based on the reference implementations and what we kind of generally agree on, but we don't want to put properties into the spec that then, like, you know, Teradata is like forced to like go implement or something. It's like, no, you know, they can deal with it exactly how they want to, and they can make, you know, requirements on configuration and things like that that are outside of what the reference implementation does, but it's not required from a spec perspective. I think that's a little dangerous.
We have one. That's the default naming mapping for and that's the one I'm thinking of as the most dangerous one as well.
But that's also somewhat contradictory, because we say you have to project by ID. That's a requirement, and then we provide an alternative.
JK.
So that one's a little weird. I think we should largely ignore that, and we shouldn't use that as a reason to bring in other things.
No, I agree. Yeah, that's why I'm saying dangerous and not happy. So.
Yeah, I think we need to make it clear, because the reason I was asking this question was, I remember in some discussions there were people brought up like these set of configurations are, I forgot the argument, maybe it's about like it's in the website documentation and it's a part of the spec. Yeah, but we need to make that clear, I think. Yeah.
I think where there are things that it's clear that it is a REST implementation detail, we should either call it out as a property that needs to be adhered to, or we should up-level that to actual specification. And a good example of that, Edward's got a draft PR out there for the credentials. So right now we pass back credentials as just like properties in that configuration, We've had a number of asks from places like, Salesforce and a couple others that are like, can we pull this up into top level specification so that we aren't like reading properties to configure this stuff? And people know how do they actually receive credentials from the catalog to access the underlying data. So in those cases, I think it's well worth exploring, like, should they be properties or should they be part of the REST spec? And if it's just an implementation detail that is like a good signal, then we can continue with properties. If it's something that really needs to be adhered to, we should probably up level it to actual specification.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, so the next topic is the auth manager interface. I don't know who put it in the discussion list. Anyone?
It was me, Jack. It was me. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I know I wrote the PR, but I think I put in the end that I was trying to see if I can refactor the code base so that we can have different authentication modes as we are deprecating the OAuth to endpoints and trying to standardize the support for different OAuths. And my conclusion was that I found it a bit hard to currently just generalize across SIG-V4 versus OAuth. And I feel it might be easier for someone to do this refactoring when, for example, introducing something similar to OAuth. I don't know if it's similar, but like something different like Kerberos or other authentication mechanisms. So we can properly see what is the common set of features or if it's even worth doing a refactoring. So that's why I kind of closed the PR, but would like to know what is our thoughts around this topic.
Yeah, so I think I can go first. I really enjoyed this initial PR, and I think that's a good foundation where we could build on top of it. There are some things that we need to enhance, especially in the Auth Manager interface, but as I said, I think it's a good start. I can't speak for Kerberos. I have no knowledge on that, but SIG-V4 is also very complex and requires access to the whole request. So I think that as long as we allow SIG-V4 to be implemented, we are probably good. But indeed, yes, I cannot tell for sure. What I can tell for sure, though, is it fits very well for OAuth. And so if there's appetite from the community to go forward with this design, I am willing to contribute a new PR with SIG-V4 and OAuth retrofitted to implement Auth Manager.
So I haven't looked closely at the API. I don't think I have any general opposition to up-leveling this to like an actual security manager or something like that. The one thing to watch out for in the implementation is the separation between like where the REST implementation lives and where like the cloud-specific implementations live. So like SIG-V4 is largely AWS specific, and some of the challenges that we ran into are those live in the AWS package as opposed to, or the sub-project. And the REST implementation lives in the core project. So we just need to make sure that it's pluggable in a way that like people can register and load in how they operate with SIG-V4. I think there's examples in there right now. We do some sort of like dynamic loading of the implementation classes. So if there's a better way to do that, that would be great. But we also want to consider like what the other cloud providers have for auth mechanisms and how we would put those in, even though if we don't necessarily need those implementations, just like with Kerberos, like I would let somebody who has Kerberos come and do Kerberos. Like I wouldn't go and like do it myself or encourage anybody else to actually do it. But we just need to make sure that it's capable enough to kind of handle all of those different approaches, which is a pain. Robert?
Yeah, going back on naming and for class names, I was just playing around a little bit with how we could make things like, I was just starting with Fire.io and seeing how we can make that like a service-ish kind of approach. Like you only mention, okay, you want to have S3, you want to have GCS, and then it figures out which class to load. So you don't have any fully qualified class names anywhere. Not yet in a state where I can push some proposal or something, but it definitely looks a bit promising.
I think that's the approach we took with like Python. Differences between Python and the Java implementation is, yeah, generic, like, hey, we're going to use the SIG-v4 signing or something like that, and that points to a specific implementation. At least within the Java implementation, the only counter to that is like people can't really plug in custom implementations, but I don't think that's really necessary here. For most of these, it's pretty standardized, and if you have one implementation, that's good enough.
Yeah. So the approach I was taking was like, okay, it can be generic, and it's easy to extend, but I'm not happy with one certain aspect of the prototype, but in general, it looks very promising. Just a heads up.
So Alex, did you say you were going to pick that up and come up with the draft PR?
Yes, I can. We can move the discussion there. Like I said, I can't speak for Kerberos, but all the rest, yes. So let's maybe do that.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Any other comments? Okay, so the next topic is introduce notifications database events as a way to standardize catalog interactions with other systems. Whoever put up that item?
Hey guys, this is Maninder. So I'm from Snowflake. I wanted to get a high level understanding on how the community feels about it. I'll describe this, but I can later follow up with a more detailed proposal. But at a high level, in an Iceberg data lake, we have this catalog, and then there are many clients. Now, clients could be another database engines, janitors, or whoever is part of that data lake. So currently, the only way these clients understand what's happening on the catalog is like they have to really crawl the REST API spec, like look for all the namespaces, look for all tables, look to understand what has changed. So we feel like this is not efficient, as well as there are places where the clients might miss a bunch of intermediate changes. And couple of scenarios where this is useful is, let's say a new namespace or table appeared on the catalog. The clients want to be informed that something like this has happened, so that maybe if you are a database, you can represent this onto your console. Then there are databases that maintain a state on their end. Like in case of Snowflake, like we maintain our own stats. It's useful to understand when a change has happened on the catalog so that Snowflake can then kind of do a refresh to say and update its stat. I do see other use cases where other clients could potentially trigger their workflows if some interesting event has happened on the catalog, or maybe some other use cases where they can contribute into auditing things that have happened, or maybe we can build consistency checking based on what all interesting things they are happening on the catalog. So this is just like a high level thing. I'll follow up with more details, but I wanted to get some initial feelers on what do you guys feel? Is it useful or any thoughts in general?
So my initial thoughts are, I like the idea of events. Some of the examples that you gave are a little concerning to me because it kind of gets into the situation of like dual source of truth. Like if you're relying on events for, hey, this new table showed up in a namespace, but I'm not calling list namespaces, you have a split source of truth because you're now relying on guaranteed delivery of those events and things like that to actually, get listing or have listing behavior. That aside, there may be specific examples, and like for different events and event types, we can go through like, hey, what are the pros and cons of each of those events? At the high level, my biggest concern is I don't think we can require that clients either emit or receive these events, so they can't ever be in a path where it's necessary for correct behavior.
Yes. So I understand uh, like all I'm trying to do is like probably we need to standardize so that vendors can provide a way, and maybe the vendors can say that I provide these message delivery guarantees and maybe I provide stronger or the weaker guarantees. But it's still good to have a standardization so that like all the clients they understand that which endpoints, what is a common mechanism where they can either pull the events or they can subscribe to it. And I don't see it as kind of saying that there is like there are just more paths to get the events, but catalog is still the source. As in, catalog is still the source that says that namespace exists or not. So catalog is still the authority. Now, if a catalog vendor says that I am providing guarantees that I'll at least retain the event, or I provide stronger delivery guarantees, then client can make an assumption that yes, I can rely on that. Or then the client can take a choice saying, okay, my vendor, catalog vendor doesn't provide those guarantees. In this case, yes, I got an event, but let me do a list namespace as well, just for correctness.
The other thing that I would think is, how do we propagate the events? Because we don't, like, one option is we add it to the REST spec as some sort of, WebSocket or some other mechanism to actually propagate events. But we can't rely necessarily on, cloud-based queues or topics or something like so. There's additional things that come along with that eventing infrastructure.
Yeah.
We have to think through, hey, what does that look like? How do we define those payloads? How do we standardize these things?
Exactly. So the thing over here is that we should not force a certain implementation or force a certain cloud provider specific implementation. What we still want is to have a standard interface, as in how the client should ask for the events and how they should say, okay, this is how I can subscribe to it. And a way for vendors to say, like, in context of the previous discussion, like these are the capabilities that I really support for my events.
Dimitri?
Yes, thanks. I just was thinking about that, and I think that's actually maybe a good example to leverage the new capabilities thing, in the sense that we don't really have to put events in the REST spec, rather, because like WebSockets or anything like that, that still imposes a lot of implementation burden on the server. But what we could probably do is we could expose a capability per kind of technology. Like if you want to do WebSockets for events, that can be a capability, and the server could declare, now I support events via WebSockets, and then we can have a separate specification for how exactly you structure your payload. And then if somebody comes up with a different channel, they can introduce another capability, and then implementations can either switch or they have to be pre-configured or something like that.
Yes, but I agree. Like we need to introduce capabilities, as in like how the vendor is trying to implement events. But it will be still great to probably have something in the REST spec so that we can create a generic client that can still like maybe just like in one example, if I say like if there's a topic somewhere, let's abstract it out. Regardless of the implementation, the client can say, I can pull all the events from this topic from a certain point onward. So that could be a pull-based thing that could be generic based on whatever implementation you choose. The other interface could be, okay, I maybe want to subscribe, and this is my URL and the auth that you call back. Now, regardless of your implementation, you can still call that URL. And the third one could be like maybe WebSocket based. But it would be good if we can have it as part of the REST spec, at least some part of it, so that not everybody have to re-implement their clients or re-implement them for each of the vendors.
JB?
Yeah, I failed to see how it's related to Iceberg. I mean, Jay speaking. I understand if the purpose of event is to trigger some action on Iceberg, like I don't know, creating a table or updating a table, then how it's related to the spec? It's an implementation uh, details. I mean, or like vendor specific thing. I fail to understand why it should be in the spec compared to something in a specific implementation.
Yeah. So this is like again, like going back, like when we think about the spec, we just think about the catalogs, but we don't think about all the clients in the rest of the data lake that rely on catalog. And they rely on, let's say, if something appears on the catalog, they want to do something about it. Or if they are maintaining their own stats, they want to do it in a reasonable way, in a correct way, so that they can process things, they can make changes on their end. So that's where like this probably doesn't make sense if we are just thinking of Iceberg as only the catalog, but it makes more sense if we say that the spec is not just about the catalog, but also effectively supporting all the clients that are talking to the catalog.
Okay, so it's not related Iceberg. It's more client of the Iceberg catalog. So in my opinion, I don't see how it should be in the spec by itself. I mean, it could be an extension of the spec. Why not? But in the core spec, I'm not sure if it's a good idea or not.
Okay, I think a lot will come down to, I think, like which events are we talking about, what use cases are we talking about. So I think we're open to hearing more about what you're thinking, but some of the use cases initially kind of surprised me. Jack?
So from my perspective, I think I also have the concern about guarantee delivery. That it is almost impossible to guarantee a delivery, and if that is the case, should we take some other like more polling based approach in the spec at least, and then you can convert that into a notification source to the client side. For example, I remember there were other proposed solutions for other topics like having system tables, information schema to describe the overall state of the catalog. Just a thought. I'm not saying we want to go with that. So that is my first comment. And the second comment is regarding what we have been discussing about even suppose we implement that, do we do like this, like a WebSocket, those kind of things? And that goes back to, so far we have been calling this the Iceberg REST catalog, which is that we use the REST interface as the main exchange layer, which is HTTP. And when we say REST, different people have different definition of REST, but it's kind of mainly following this resource path, JSON request response models. But do we want to extend beyond that? Because even for example, some other features, such as the pre-planned plan that we are working on, there were questions like comments about if this is, for example, streaming lots of scan tags, do we want to use like HTTP2 for streaming or the work? So are we limiting our technology for the Iceberg REST spec only to REST, or are we thinking about other things? So that is another topic we might want to discuss in more details. That's my two comments.
So like again, like the way the mechanism, we can separate the mechanism from having a notion of events. For example, like I can fit events into a REST only kind of thing. As in, you can say that anything that is interesting happens on, let's say, a certain, you add it onto a queue or whatever as a resource on the REST spec. This at least means that you don't have to poll the entirety of the list namespaces, list tables, and all that stuff, and you don't miss certain interesting events, but you can just maybe fetch all the interesting things that happened in a certain duration. So this way, you don't really have to go into let's say WebSocket or really like or reliable delivery kind of stuff. But you still have this notion of saying that on the catalog side, these were all the interesting things that happened. So we can start with something restrictive, and then when we have more clarity into do we want our spec to allow like different technologies, then we can maybe evolve this notion to support um, other technologies like WebSocket or HTTP2 that you were talking about.
Again, I think it comes down to like specific use cases. So if we can get some ideas of like which events are we talking about, how do we think that they fit? Because like to JB's point, like there are a lot of eventing things you can do that just fall entirely outside of what Iceberg and the REST spec is. And are we trying to shoehorn like backend implementations into the specification, or is there like real merit to what we're trying to add there? And so I think it just comes down to the specific cases. Like we have some as an example, like the scan metrics is really an event where we're sending from the client to the server information about how it performed and what actually happened in an operation. So there are cases that there is valuable information and meaning, but there may also be a lot of cases that it's more functional, like, hey, how do we building our implementation, as opposed to something that should be standardized.
Got it. Yeah, so I'll follow back with more details, and maybe I'll send something on the dev channel, and we can use that to provide more feedback. But thanks, everyone.
Okay, I think we are right at the time for discussing the last point. Can we move the meeting to Wednesday where there's no Iceberg syncs? The initial reason I scheduled it on Monday was because I think the Python thing are on Tuesday and the community thing are on Wednesday. So I just picked one of the other days. And also because I'm scheduling this weekly, that means it might conflict with the community thing if I schedule it on the same day. Well, what are people's thoughts on the exact logistics about this?
I mean, my thinking was that it would just happen on the other 2 Wednesdays where there's no Iceberg sync. That's why I commented on the doc.
So 2 weeks on, 1 week. So 2 REST syncs, then the community sync.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, it conflicts with the package sync. This this one is 6. But I'm okay, like you can drop halfway.
Okay, I think maybe an action item is I can propose a few time slots on the dev list, and we can see what everyone thinks. Okay, sounds good. We have 3 minutes before the end of the meeting. Any other topics? Cool. I guess we will have 2 minutes back for everyone. Thanks everyone for joining, and see you guys next week.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion.